Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Trevisani from Worldwide Markets. On behalf of Worldwide Markets and FX Street, I'd like to thank you to our today's webinar. We are going to discuss, or I'm going to discuss, if anyone has any questions or comments, or in this case, since this is not, I don't know as much about this particular topic as I would like to. If anyone has any comments, criticisms, or extra information about what I'm talking about, which is going to be Argentina, and the interplay between Argentinian politics and economics, please type it into the Forex Live chat, and I'll be glad to discuss it and listen, in this case, today. I'm doing something a little differently today than I normally do. I'm going to explore, or attempt to explore, a topic which has long interested me, fascinated me, if you will. And it is, and those of you who've been to my webinars before know that one of my interests is the impact, and sometimes the incalculable impact, of culture on a group or a nation's or even an empire's history. When we look at Argentina, and in comparison, of course, the country that I know best, the United States, we see two lands. This is a brief history of the Argentine peso. Let me actually get a better chart up there. Okay, this is growth rates of historical growth rates of Argentina. The longest one I could find. It's a little hard to get quality information on Argentina. And unfortunately, my Thomson Reuters information system was down this morning, so I was further crippled as far as getting good charts. Okay, so we're going to have to go mostly with what I managed to obtain on the web. The puzzle of Argentina is, for me, the contrast between its enormous, United States-like, if you will, agricultural and resource wealth and potential, and the inability, in the modern era at any rate, since about 1930, to maintain the type of political stability that's necessary to run a modern economy. The reasons are, of course, tied to Argentina's political history. Her settlement dates back to the Spanish colonial era, of course, about the same time frame as the United States. However, the political inheritance of the Spanish colonies, the Spanish colonial empire, has been very different and was very different than the inheritance of the British colonial empire in the United States. A brief bit of Argentine history, and again, I'm sure there are people out there in the audience who probably know parts of this, if not all of this topic, better than I do. So I'm perfectly willing to and happy to entertain a dialogue on this particular topic because of its ramifications across many different fields. This is not simply a historical discussion. It's not simply a political discussion. It's certainly not an economics discussion. It would be very difficult, if not impossible, to understand Argentinian economic history without reference to politics. Now, you could do a much more complete job of that here in the United States. Of course, there is always interplay between the two. After all, the political environment, the legal environment, sets the background and the permission for all that goes on in the economic sphere. But the one way to look at the history now, let me just give you a brief little bit about Argentinian history, which was relatively new to me. The wars of empire, or the wars of independence from the Spanish colonial empire, took place in about the first 20 years of the 19th century, not long after those in the United States, which of course was one of the inspirations, along I suppose with the French Revolution, to liberation. And there were various, it's a very large continent, and it was not a uniform set of leaders, and it was not in any sense a unified area. One advantage that geographically, also politically, one of the great advantages that the US colonial rebellion had in the late 18th century was a relatively coherent inheritance. The biggest split, of course, was which later blew apart the country in the US Civil War, almost 100 years after the founding of the United States in 1781, or whatever date you look, 1789 for the Constitutional Convention, wherever you want to look for it, was the slavery issue. But aside from that, the political and the economic differences, of course, were quite large between the planters in the South and yeoman farmers and, beginning manufacturing in the Northeast. But the political culture inherited was largely uniform. And although it has been said, and I believe it, that in the American Revolution, you had 1/3 of the population roughly that wanted to be independent, 1/3 that wanted to remain a colony of England under King George, and 1/3 that was undecided. It was the revolutionaries, the 1/3 who wanted independence, that carried the day. But it was not without tremendous internal problems within the colonial movement. The political unity, though, of the colonies was quite remarkable, considering some of the economic differences. Now, relatively speaking, though, the area from the northern Spanish colonies in what is now California and New Mexico to the most southern California, the southern Spanish colonies in Argentina, reaching all the way down, and Chile, reaching all the way down to Patagonia, is a much greater distance. And there was nor I suppose could there be, but there certainly wasn't any sense of political unity. In the US, in its colonial revolution, there was political unity, at least within the independence movement. There were men from Massachusetts, and there were men from Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, although less so, being recently settled. The view of the American colonialists was, if they disagreed on many, many things, they did agree at that moment that this was a incipient, a potential country. All the colonies, all 13 of them, participated in one independence movement. The Spanish colonies in Latin and South America, or Central and South America, from Mexico down to Patagonia, was a very, very, very different endeavor. And of course, there is one huge difference. That is Brazil, which was in fact a Portuguese colony. Although it participated in the general idea and the general movement towards independence, it being a separate cultural entity, went its own way. So the Spanish colonies skirted Brazil, which at one point in late time history was the Empire of Brazil. The disunity, matter of fact, the impossibility of unity, perhaps, from Mexico down to Argentina is partly a function of geography, of distance, of the difficulty of communication, of the lack of a navy, if you will. The easiest way for Americans, colonialists, to travel was up and down the coasts and up and down the rivers that penetrated the plain, the sloping plain of the country down from the Appalachian Mountains, which at the colonial period were the limit primarily, not completely, but primarily, certainly along the seaboard, of colonization and European settlement in North America. Relatively speaking, the ease of travel compared to South America, and the very highly developed merchant marine of the colonialists. Now, of course, once the revolution became an actual shooting war, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, dominated the oceans and made it much harder for the colonials to communicate via sea, since the British maintained a blockade on most of the Atlantic coast. However, in the 150 years before that, almost 200 years, 170 years, between the settlement at Jamestown in 1609 and 1776, the ability and frequency of communication up and down the coasts and the very highly developed merchant marine of the colonies made for a unified outlook, except of course for slavery. And there are other things as well. And if you look at the history of the United States before the Civil War and the recurring slavery issue, the recurrence of the slavery issue, and the inability to find a permanent settlement. Well, if the reason is not for lack of trying, it's not even for lack of goodwill, it's an impossibility. The abolitionists, as the century wore on, became more and more of a moral question. And certainly it's understandable how slavery could be viewed and was viewed as a moral issue. And on moral issues, it is far less likely to find political solutions, be that as it may. The lack of this type of communication, the enormous differences and the enormous distances of the Spanish colonial empire, and I would say to some degree the colonial cultural inheritance and the centralization and really lack of settlement throughout much of the Spanish colonial empire, dictated a very, very different history once it began. As I've said, the colonial movement in the United States was essentially one of all 13 colonies. Within each colony, there were, as I said, a third, and a third. But amongst the forces, the political forces and the military forces supporting independence from Britain, there were differences, but they were not differences of strategy. They were largely differences of tactics. So all 13 colonies, as I said, participated. It is very, very different in Central and South America. There were numerous movements, numerous leaders. There was a barely brief period in the beginning of some sort of unity. Some of the leaders, Jose Marte, I think, had visions, if you will, of a unified government for most, if not all, of the Spanish colonies, but they were never close to being enacted, and they were never headed by a uniform movement. The various areas all had their own movements, their own leaders. That disparate, divided history is mirrored in the history of Argentina. The liberation movement, the liberation wars in Argentina lasted about 10 years or so, vis-a-vis Spain. But once that took place, Argentina had almost a 40-year internecine, if you will, conflict between the provinces, central government, or the central city of Buenos Aires, and involving in and out over the years leaders, governments, and various other parts of bordering countries, Uruguay and Paraguay in particular, not so much Chile, separated by the Andes. So the impossibility, I'm not going to say inability, I'm going to say impossibility of a uniform government in the Spanish Empire was mirrored in many of the individual countries themselves. That, it's my idea, that inheritance, that political heritage of Argentina is one that has bedeviled it into the modern era. So let's leave that alone for a second and talk a little bit about the wealth of the country. After the political settlement, which unified the country about 1860, Argentina experienced the same type of emigration influx that the United States did slightly later. In fact, I think the greatest number of immigrants numerically to a country in Argentina is only second to those of the United States. And just to give you some statistics about that, by the end of 40 years of Argentine history, after the unification, essentially under the central government of Buenos Aires, these are some of the facts. The population in those 40 years, from 1870 to 1910, grew 5 times, much of it immigration. Wheat exports went from 100,000 to 2.5 million tons. 2.5 million tons. Beef exports from 25,000 to 365,000. Railway mileage from 500,000 kilometers to 31,000. Now, in that period, of course, railroads were exploding everywhere in the developed world. The United States certainly saw that. It was the same type of technological revolution that affected everything, basically, as we have seen now with the internet. Methods of doing business, methods of communication, markets, everything about the economy pretty much was affected by the ability to ship and move goods and people on the railroads. The railroads were, without question, the disruptive technology of the 19th century, lasting well into the 20th century. I recently took a train for the first time from Penn Station, which is the old hub of the Pennsylvania Railroad, meaning from New York out west, and the links to Chicago in the Midwest, at 34th Street on the west side. Now, I hadn't been in that station in many, many years. It compares to the other hub link, Grand Central Terminal, of which the 19th century building still exists. It is easy to see and to understand the pride, accomplishment, and grandiosity, if you will, of the men who built the railroads. That they understood that what they were doing was both new and unique and earth-shaking, if you will. Grand Central is a glorious building, Beaux Arts building in New York City. It survived. Penn Station, in the collapse of the railroads and their freight business and many other business, the reorganization in the 50s and the 60s, as the American interstate highway system was built under President Eisenhower and its flexibility killed the railroad freight business to a large degree. And then airplanes came and took the passenger business. So by the mid to late 60s, railroads were collapsing. Under that impetus, the Pennsylvania Railroad, I forget the man's name, I'm in the Penn Central at that time, but I think it was the Pennsylvania Railroad. I forget the man's name, his infamous quote was, "Does it make any sense to save a building simply as a monument?" So they tore down the Penn Station. And when I was there last weekend, I have seen pictures of it. We have these large scale photographs of the old Penn Station in my house. And I'm familiar with them. I've looked at them many times. They're up on the walls. Comparing the glorious space and the distances and the almost ennobling features of the architect, someone who was simply using a train, a commuter, to the current underground, cramped, low-ceilinged, and phenomenally crowded Penn Station, the only answer that can be said to that head, whose name I forget, of the Penn Racer, that yes, it does make sense to save buildings and many other things as monuments. So the disruptive technology of the 19th century of the railroads was in Argentina as well. So the phenomenal growth that many industrial processes provided after the American Civil War or after the Argentine political settlement in about 1860 was mirrored everywhere around the world, in the developed world. The populations grew, public health measures, the most important ones were the development of systems of public sanitation, meaning sewers, piped water. Those things did more to curtail death rates than almost anything else that's been done since then. So those things were exactly the same in Argentina. Argentina is a phenomenally wealthy country from its resources. Cattle. I remember I'm looking, there's a famous movie from it's one of the early Fred Astaire and Ginger Roger featured roles. They were not the headline, actually. It's made about 1932, 1933. At the end of this period of phenomenal growth in the Argentinian economy, it's called Flying Down to Rio. Now, Rio is, of course, Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, but I use the title because it mirrors the idea that these countries at that point in 1930, 1920, were viewed as in very wealthy, developed countries. Another figure, literacy in Argentina went from 22 to 65%. In Argentina, a level, according to this article, higher than most other Latin American countries would reach for 50 years. By 1920, Argentina's per capita income was 70% higher than Italy's, 90% higher than Spain's, higher than Japan's, Brazil's. It was a phenomenal and rather exceptional achievement for the Argentine people and the Argentinian economy and the political system. The inheritance, though, of Argentina's political factionalism, and there's really no other way to look at it. That almost 50-year period, 40-year period of domestic warfare, civil war, essentially, before one side, the federals in the province of Buenos Aires, essentially defeated all opponents and began to rule the country as a unified entity. That political inheritance would later come to haunt Argentinian political history. Beginning in about 1930, the army and political leaders began a recurring series of coups d'etats, of assassinations, of populist movements. One of the most famous one, of course, being that of Juan Domingo Perón and his famous second wife, Evita, whose life history was later made into a phenomenally successful musical, Evita, by Andrew Lloyd Webber. The willingness of these, and the history is both convoluted and not one that's particularly profitable to talk about in detail in such a venue as this. But one of the most distressing facts about it is its willingness to use and champion violence against its own people. In the 60s and the 70s, the 1960s and 1970s, and for Argentina stretching into the 80s and beyond, actually in Europe stretching into the 80s as well, the threat of populist, Marxist, communist, whatever you would like to call it, opposition to the ordered capitalist society never really reached, in the United States, it was never more than a tiny, tiny faction that never remotely threatened the stability of the country, the stability of the government, or threatened a large number of people, or gathered the large number, the allegiance of a large number of people. But that's not true in Latin America. It's certainly not true in Argentina. And the threat of these, they call themselves revolutionaries, and leftist movements, was much more potent and much more powerful. It was more powerful in Europe as well, certainly in Italy with the Red Brigades, but they also never really threatened the system, if you will, although the communists as a party were potent and electorally potent in many European countries. But in Argentina and Chile as well, and you see this today, there are leftist governments in a number of countries in middle Central America, middle South America. The repression and the military coups, and then the violence of the leftists, I mean, the predominance of power always seemed to be on the side of the establishment, if you will, the military. But the extremes to which they went to suppress the movements, the term that it's referred to in many places, the dirty war in the 1980s, are something that it's difficult for a resident of the United States to understand. Perhaps there's more understanding in Europe. And it's this inheritance of the violence and the factionalism of that period in Argentinian history, those 50 years or 40 years from 1820 to 1860, never seems to have gone very far from the political consciousness in the country. And the result, once this type of recurring political violence, alternating with elections, alternating with coups, alternating with assassinations, took hold. You have to also factor in the very evident populism of Perón. Now, when Perón was in power in the 50s, and actually into the 70s, but the first time was in the 50s. Actually, no, in the late 40s and into the 50s. One of the things he did, which was very common at the time, it was the same thing that the British Labour governments did in England at the same time. It never happened really in the United States, but it did happen in many other places. In ways, I think the inheritance of the political inheritance of Argentina seems very much to me to be, and I guess this makes sense, of course, considering their Spanish inheritance, the political inheritance of continental Europe and not the inheritance of the British Isles. And the inheritance of the British Isles is what the United States and Canada have. And it seems to, not seems to, it has fostered a very different political culture. The United States and Canada have never had a coup. They've never had a military coup. It's not even something that has ever been remotely contemplated. I remember I'm reading a history of a political history of England, of the United Kingdom, and I am just about at the time of Cromwell. The author, the man's name is William Wilcox. It's very good. It's not a political history, it's a history of political culture. And he said that at one point that the British experience with the military dictatorship, that's what it was, of Oliver Cromwell was such that they never felt the need to repeat the experience. That was in the 1660s, 1670s, after King Charles I was beheaded, regicide. And there's wisdom to that statement. The also essentially civilian makeup of British culture is one that was inherited by the United States and Canada. It does not provide for the idea of military dictatorship as a necessity to provide order. This is quite different than the inheritance on the continent. Starting with the French Revolution and down through the years, unfortunately, well into the 20th century, the political makeup of mass movements in the continent has much in common, both in origin and in mirroring, with what you have seen throughout Latin and South America. The political cultures are both an inheritance and an outgrowth of one's culture and history. And this, to my initial analysis, is largely the difference between North and Central and South America in their political and their economic history. Because what happens is that economies, and this is just basic examination, economies don't thrive under political turmoil. Economies don't thrive under confrontation. They don't thrive under recurring cycles of political violence and political dislocation. The greatest growth of the Argentinian economy in the years in the explosion of the Industrial Revolution after 1860, 1850, is one that they fully participated in more than the rest, than anybody else in South America. You can say that perhaps they're because of the inheritance of, or the effect of immigration, that is the most European of all the South, Latin and South, the Central and South American countries. And I would tend to agree with that, although I've never been there. But the inheritance, the cultural and political inheritance, is one of conflict and revolutionary violence, if you will. It is very, very different. Now, the United States received huge numbers of immigrants from many of the same countries, but it seems, in retrospect, quite evident that the establishment of the United States, this is the contrast I'm trying to make here, because in many ways, although the size is not as great, the physical and environmental heritage resources of Argentina were on a par with those of the United States as far as their ability to provide resources and advantages for economic growth. Different, of course, but to the same degrees of plenitude and multitude. The types of things that were available to the Argentinian nation were similar to those of the United States, and the tremendous success of the period after the American Civil War in the 1860s, 1880s, the Gilded Age, if you will, the Industrial Revolution, proves that. But the immigrants from the same countries, Italy and many, many other countries, I just happen to know that there are a lot of Italian immigrants went to Argentina, where they probably found, since it was a Spanish Romance language country, maybe they thought that there would be more congenial environment, whereas the Anglo-Saxon inheritance of the United States was not nearly as apparently congenial. However, the US political culture was by that time firmly established. Having fought a civil war, a terrible civil war, the Americans both knew who they were and knew what their country was. That seems not to have been the case, and there was never any real history of the type of movement-based political violence. The only civil war the United States ever fought was, I think, as Churchill, what did Churchill say? The war which was no other war was ever, I can't remember the exact quote, was ever sought to be avoided more times unless in the end able to be avoided because of its moral course, something like that. Sorry, I completely botched that quote. But what he meant was the Americans tried, the United States and its political system tried over and over again to find a solution amenable to both sides of the slavery issue from the very beginning. And there was no solution. Never was a war more inevitable over a real issue than the war of the American Civil War. So aside from that one war, any type of violent rebellion was minuscule. There were one or two. And the mass of the nation believed and owed allegiance to the central government and the various state governments. So there was no inheritance of political violence. Yes, there were anarchist bombing in the 20s and all sorts of individual items, but there was never, except for the Civil War, any sense of a political competition. States did not take up arms against each other. But the problem is that's exactly what they did in the period of 1820 to 1860 in Argentina. And that history of violence, I think, was some which was far too easily accessible from the 1930s on. And it has been enacted. And what has been the result, of course? It has been hyperinflation, deflation, populism, and a serious and prolonged drop in Argentine growth and wealth. Argentina is still a wealthy country, relatively speaking, but the rest of the world has long since passed by. Even recently, Mauricio Macri was elected a year ago to replace the Kirchners, first Nestor and then Christina, populists. But populists in the sense of putting their country and its economy in opposition to much of the world's financial system. Now, of course, there's an argument to be made, and one which gets made over and over again, but it's not one that I largely accept, that, you know, the various nations which run the world's financial systems, the United States and a few others, use it to further their own interests and to impoverish the rest of the world. I don't buy this argument. I do know, and I do connote and believe that, yes, the U.S. does use does order the system much to its benefit, but it's also not a system which is impossible for other countries to utilize as well. Part of Argentina and other South American countries as well, but primarily Argentina, has been its sense of opposition and, if you will, futility to operating within that system. Russia defaulted on its debt and was very soon back in good graces, Russia having a similar type of resource inheritance, but a quite different political inheritance. So what we've seen in this rather brief examination, and I hope it's been of some use, is that no matter what the resource development, you can contrast, if you will, the history of Argentina with the history of Singapore. Now, size, of course, is of very different scale in these two nations, but I'm pretty familiar with the history and the success of Singapore, having lived there for a number of years, just before the turn of the century, the last century. And that is a country without any resources whatsoever, but a culture both of stability and economic achievement, which has fostered enormous economic success. It is the culture which determines, as it determines politics, it helps to determine the political, the economic success of the nation state or the unified political economy. And I think the Europeans, to take this a little further afield, with the coming election in France and in other countries in Europe, need to take this lesson to heart. Politics, as an American said, is downstream from culture. That's Andrew Breitbart. And its concept is very true. It is the necessity for people to be willing to, one, have a worldview in consonant, and if not about particular issues, about the ideas and the ways in which political differences are expressed and worked out, and their view towards authority. In that sense, economics is also, and I think that's probably the point of this discussion, downstream from culture. And the three examples that I've spoken about here today, one briefly Singapore, and two extensively the United States and Argentina, bear out this point. Despite their similar inheritance from the natural world, meaning resources, their very different inheritance from the cultural world, the political cultural world, has made their history very different. The United States never experienced a period like the Dirty War. The United States has never had a coup. The United States does not look to the military to restore order. Civilians are securely in control in the United States. I will say, I know there are people probably shaking their heads there, that in my view, the election of Donald Trump is surely in this tradition. This is not a dangerous event, but I'll leave that one aside. The political inheritance, which is essentially a cultural inheritance, is what has determined the last 80 years of Argentine history. It is not a advent from the outside. It is internal and has been internal in Argentine political culture. Okay, folks, I hope this has been instructive. It was a little bit unusual what I tried to do today. I hope it has met with some success. I thank you all for attending. We are the Market Directions interview, which is put on by Worldwide Markets and FX Street every Wednesday at 10 a.m. I will interview a colleague and friend of mine, Boris Schlossberg, a very well-known and successful economic and political analyst here in New York City. A member, one of the founders of BK Asset Management with Kathy Lean. That will be at 10 o'clock on Wednesday. I hope you can all attend. You can find the sign up on the FX Street site under their general listing and also under Market Directions interviews. I thank you all very much for attending. We will see everyone next Monday. Everyone have a good day. Take care.